In 1921, the African-American actor and singer Paul Robeson arrives in London for the first time. Robeson grew up in the United States during an era of racial apartheid and official segregation known as Jim Crow. And his visit to London is the first time he's ever been in an unsegregated country. In the US, there are entire states where he can't go on tour because no hotels will take him. Lynchings are at their peak, and Robeson himself has to give up a career in the law after his boss tells him that no white client will ever hire him as a lawyer, and an office stenographer tells him, "I never take dictation from an..." By contrast, London of the 1920s and 30s feels like freedom for the first time. Robeson's wife Essie marvels that they can dine in any public place, and Robeson himself says that on the continent, the colour bar does not exist. They go to parties with celebrities and aristocrats and are welcomed at the swankiest hotels and restaurants in the country. However, after a few years in and out of London, the Robesons start noticing ways that they are still being treated differently because of their skin colour. Paul falls in love with a white woman called Yolanda Jackson, and although she will have a long affair with Paul, marrying him would be a step too far. And in 1929, the Robesons arrive at the glamorous Savoy Hotel, only to be turned away from the dining room by the manager. In a city with legal or explicit apartheid, that would be the end of the story. You are simply turned away from an establishment, no one cares, and it suffers no consequences. But in 1920s London, things are murkier, which changes what happens next. London doesn't have any equivalent of the United States Jim Crow laws. The film Darkest Hour can have a black man riding in a tube carriage full of white folks in 1940 and have it be totally historically accurate. But that doesn't mean that there isn't less formal, off-the-books segregation going on anyway. In this video, we're going to look at whether you can plausibly say that London ever had segregation, and if so, how much. As always, this is a London channel, so we're not going to be talking about things like the Battle of Bamber Bridge, where violence broke out between black and white American soldiers stationed in Lancashire over attempts to segregate the local pub, although it is a fascinating episode, and I recommend reading more about it if you're interested. And although we typically think about black and white people when we think about segregation, the history of racial segregation in London, as far as I've been able to trace, actually doesn't start with black people. It starts with the Jews. If you're in medieval London and you want to get into a trade like, say, candle making, you can't just buy a load of wax and start gooping it. The candle makers in London have a guild, a kind of combination union and regulatory body. If you want to become a candle maker, you have to join the Candle Makers Guild first. And it's not just candle makers. It's tailors, carpenters, weavers, leatherworkers, fishmongers, brewers. Basically every trade or craft you can think of has a guild. The guilds are really picky about who they let in. You have to be a London citizen, so no one from outside London, and definitely not from other countries. But the guilds also don't accept Jews, even London-born Jews. So if you're Jewish, there aren't a lot of options for you in terms of your job. Now you might think, well, that's not racial segregation, it's religious. But you aren't allowed to join a guild even if you convert. In fact, from 1232, there's a charity house on Chancery Lane called the Domus Conversorum for converted Jews to have somewhere to live, because otherwise it's basically bloody impossible to make a living. In 1253, the Statute of Jewry is passed, requiring Jews to wear a badge, and in 1290, the Edict of Expulsion forbids Jewish people from living in England altogether. 3,000 people are forced onto boats and deported, and anything they leave behind is seized by the Crown. This law remains in place until the 1650s, when It isn't exactly repealed, but the leader of the country, Oliver Cromwell, makes it clear that he will no longer enforce it. So under that law, London is legally segregated for 400 years. Non-Jews only. Although we do know that there is a small Jewish community living in London before the 1650s, they keep their heads down and they don't get too much bother, but legally, they're not allowed to be here. And just because Jews are allowed back in the country doesn't mean you're allowed to hold any job you want. Some workplaces are still segregated. Until 1858, if you want to become an MP, you have to swear a Christian oath, so Jews can't join the House of Commons. When King's College London first opens in the 1820s, professors have to be members of the Church of England, and students have to go to chapel every day. Some official government jobs aren't open to Jews until 1890. And then in the 20th century, London's black population starts to rise. There have been black Londoners for hundreds of years, but compared to somewhere like the US, it's a relatively small percentage throughout the height of the transatlantic slave trade. So there aren't really a lot of explicit laws and policies of segregation. If you're a racist hotel owner, you probably won't get any black clients. And if you do, you can just say, oh, sorry, we're full. It's not going to be such a common occurrence that you go, aren't there laws against this sort of thing? So segregation becomes more individuated and unofficial. And this cuts both ways. In one sense, because there are no laws, it means a new manager can take over your local restaurant and factory and segregate it, and there's not much you can do. But it also means that people can just quietly move with the times, change their minds, and let black people drink in their pub when maybe they wouldn't have before, without it being a whole thing. Once you make it a formal law, it's a lot more difficult to change. So this is the situation London is in at the start of World War II, when thousands of soldiers arrive in London, including lots from the US and the Caribbean. The Imperial War Museum curator Emily Charles says that soldiers from overseas basically doubled the black population in Britain during the war. The British government is really worried about how to balance white officers from the southern US who expect segregation and black soldiers from the US and the Caribbean. Britain can't do without the help of either. One minister's secretary, Oliver Harvey, put it like this: if we treat them naturally as equals, then there will be trouble with the southern officers. If we treat them differently, then there will be trouble with the North Americans. The government seems to have decided that the best bet is just not to say anything and kind of hope it's fine. The US War Office and the British Ministry of Information make a film for American soldiers called A Welcome to Britain, where a nice old British lady has an extremely boring milquetoast chat with a black and a white soldier.
Have you come to my Birmingham? You come to my home and have a cup of tea with me, both of you.
Thank you, we will.
Goodbye and good luck.
Goodbye. Bye-bye.
And then the white soldier turns to camera and says, hey, did you get a load of that? Isn't this country weird?
Now look, men, you heard that conversation. That's not unusual here. It's the sort of thing that happens quite a lot. Just what you heard, an English woman asking a colored boy to tea. She was polite about it, and he was polite about it. Now, look, that might not happen at home, but the point is, we're not at home.
But ultimately, the film tells white Americans to bury their differences with African Americans, at least while they're in Britain.
You mean that we have to get over our prejudices?
You don't get over a prejudice that easily. There's no use pretending we're different from what we are, but we can try to live up to our American promises. I'd go further and say, we can't do less.
One British Major General puts out a message saying that white women shouldn't go out with black soldiers. But in terms of hotels and restaurants, they are still able to set their own rules. Now, there are some examples of them deciding to pander to segregationists. The famous Trinidadian cricketer, Learie Constantine, books himself and his family into the Imperial Hotel in Bloomsbury for 4 nights, and even tells them in advance, hey, just so you know, so there's no trouble, we're black. But when he gets there, he's told that actually he can only stay 1 night, so they don't offend the Americans. Constantine actually sues the hotel, There's no law yet saying the hotel isn't allowed to discriminate based on race, so instead he has to sue on the grounds that he was promised a room and didn't get one. The judge awards him 5 guineas and says that he's sorry the law doesn't allow him to penalise the hotel more. And because Constantine is famous, his story gets reported widely in the press, and the response is uniformly sympathetic to him. He will go on to be a big supporter of the Race Relations Act that forbids this kind of discrimination. There are also organisations that forbid entry to black people. Fernando Enriquez is a law student who tries to join the RAF at the beginning of the war, but is refused because he's mixed race. He ends up joining the London Auxiliary Fire Service instead. When the EastEnder Amelia King applies to join the Women's Land Army, she's told in the interview that white farmers might not want her working on their land, and she should work in a munitions factory instead. And one poll found that 61% of the public who'd heard her story either disapproved or strongly disapproved of the Land Army's decision. The poll takers specifically note that even actual racists are like, yeah, we've got a war to win, this is ridiculous. In the end, a farmer in Hampshire reaches out to the Land Army specifically to offer King a position, so they give in, and King gets her way. There's also discrimination in housing. In 1959, the Guardian newspaper finds multiple adverts for rented accommodation that specify Europeans only or no coloured, although it does find a smaller number of coloured only apply, and one Oriental people welcome. Again, there are no laws on this until the 1960s, so it is legal. It's not until 1965 that segregation in public places is officially banned in the Race Relations Act, but this still doesn't cover segregated workplaces. In 1966, the Dominican train guard Asquith Xavier applies for a job at Euston Station, only to be told that Euston doesn't take on coloured people. They actually tell him that's the reason as well. It's not like, oh, well, there were just a lot of good candidates. Sorry, you didn't make the cut. They actually tell him, no, it's because we're racist. It's just very rare to get that honesty. He appeals to the Minister for Transport, Barbara Castle, and the unwritten policy is scrapped. Today, there's a plaque commemorating Xavier at Euston Station. His story is one of many similar stories from the 1950s and 60s. 2 years after Xavier's case, hiring discrimination is finally banned. And is London segregated today? A 2023 study in the Geographical Journal found that segregation is decreasing across England and Wales. I'm sometimes a bit sceptical of studies like this because sometimes they just count up how many non-white people are in an area, and whichever one has the most, they call the most diverse, even if that area is, say, all Bangladeshis. But this one actually looks at diversity within neighbourhoods and shows that across the country, you're getting less and less likely to find black neighbourhoods or Asian neighbourhoods or white neighbourhoods, that we are truly all mixing together. So there we go, a happy ending. Neighbourhoods are becoming less segregated, and since the Race Relations Act of 1968, employers can't segregate their workplaces anymore. Oh, except the Crown. Although workplaces are not allowed to be segregated, that does not include the royal household. Now, it does make sense that you'd want to write in some very narrow exceptions to anti-discrimination law. I do think employers should be allowed to take race into account if, for example, they're finding an actor to play Othello. If you run a corner shop and you want to give your nephew a couple of shifts at the weekend to help him get work experience, I think you should be able to just do that without posting the job publicly and gathering equity data to report to the government on all your applicants. And I'm sure there are other edge cases out there that I can't think of. Now, every bill has to be agreed to by the monarch before it becomes law. The monarch has never openly refused to give their consent to a British bill since the time of Queen Anne, but that doesn't mean that their ministers can't sidle over to the government and say, hey, you should probably change this, and this before you send it over. So, In 1968, the government is considering a bill banning racial discrimination in hiring. And it seems like the Queen's staff heard that Parliament was considering a racial equity law and let them know that they should write in an exemption for the Queen before they make her sign it. A civil servant from the time writes that he's been in discussions with a senior courtier and that it was not, in fact, the practice to appoint coloured immigrants or foreigners to clerical posts, only ordinary domestic posts. And the Queen gets her way. The Act doesn't explicitly mention the palace, but it writes in exceptions for every kind of job that the palace might hire for, so the law is totally unenforceable against them. The palace also gets exemptions to the 1975 Sex Discrimination Act, and even the 2010 Equality Act. Now, we don't know when that practice about not hiring people from ethnic minorities in senior positions was scrapped. The 80s? The 90s? There are records from people from ethnic minorities being employed at the palace in the 1990s, but before that, we don't have any data on the racial mix of the staff. We only know of 1 or 2 individual staff members from ethnic minorities. So, for example, we know that there was a Ghanaian press officer employed in 1959. Today, we know that 9.7% of Buckingham Palace staff are from ethnic minority backgrounds. That's compared to 18% nationally and 40% in London, where most of them are based. This falls short of even the palace's own target. But the monarch is still exempt from hiring discrimination. So if you get denied a promotion or a job based on your race or indeed any other protected characteristic, there's nowhere to take your complaint to. When the Robesons were kicked out of the Savoy Hotel in 1929, they do have some recourse in the court of public opinion. The event becomes a big news story, and the Savoy is forced to apologise. What Paul Robeson realises during his time in London is that the country is just as segregated as the US, only along class lines rather than racial ones. Paul has a university education and works on the stage, and therefore he can go places where a black dock worker can't. Newspaper journalists ask other Mayfair hotels if they operate a colour bar in their restaurant, and the most telling answer is given by the manager of the Ritz, who says, "If the Negro was a gentleman, it would be unfair to refuse him."